Chapter 21. All for Jenny. I took a vaguely optimistic deep breath, and hoped it wouldn't be among my last. And now for the clever bit assigned to the lone monkey person hereabouts, which was still unclear to me. Arthur's voice drifted across the front of my mind like a fading echo. For Jenny. It was a sense, a feeling I could only attribute to my memory of his support. I guessed what he was doing was reminding me why I was here and seeking to fortify me for what was to come. For Jenny, I repeated. There was only one way to describe what happened next. One moment it was what passed for a pleasant spring evening on the island. The next it was what might pass for a lovely evening in hell without the distraction of social media. But hey ho. It was a sudden appalling and sickly nighttime. And one with which I was familiar. Dear Lord. Here was proper physics revealing itself at a grand and nauseating scale. And it was evident that tearing a hole from one universe to another was anything but Tinker Toys. Someone somewhere had flicked a switch to change everything. Anything unimaginable from the normal depressing cold grey sky, appropriate to my general mental state right then, to bastard black and then a tummy disturbing roiling and curdling purple from the infra-scary end of someone else's hellish spectrum. The sky appeared to be falling in on itself and intent on tearing itself and everything else apart. Seemingly determined to swallow itself in appalling violence. That's big physics, I suppose. Anyway, purple was never my favorite color. For appalling effect, pieces of the outhouses began to tumble off the roofs as the wind picked up savagely and nearly knocked me off my feet. It was a demonic maelstrom that served as a simple theatrical backdrop to upcoming events. I dismissed the drama as irrelevant because I recognized Shadow's Leaking Nightmares, a place I'd recently visited. I knew then that I could soon look forward to a massive landscape filled with monsters, most of whom would be beyond my ability to describe and would all be staring hungrily back at me. I wondered whether anyone else in the universe other than Shadow and the guys and girls cared about what was happening to the ignorant monkey people on that blue planet. The end of all life on Earth would be either dramatic or an apathetic wet Sunday afternoon. But of course, we monkey people like to build everything up a bit. As if that hadn't been enough to scare me witless. The entire ruined farmhouse began to shimmer a cold and sharp-edged electric blue. The facade was shifting. It offered an appalling contrast with the self-consuming purple sky and the violent wind. I was terrified and curious that one house and associated reality could superimpose itself on another in the same space. It was really an excellent day to go shopping. Absolutely anywhere else but here would be great. I was one step closer to oblivion and had been actively encouraged to be so. After all, I had volunteered, hadn't I? As much as that was possible with Shadow poking around inside my head for the past few months. Amusingly, all I knew about my role in Shadow's grand plan to save the planet was for me to charge quickly toward the object and engage directly with the enemy. Even when Arthur had told me what was expected of me, it had sounded so appallingly corny. Even now it felt daft and silly, running across a crappy farmyard toward a pulsating house with bloody weird physics breaking down all around me. And I wondered if this was being filmed by aliens elsewhere, and whether they were all eating mashed potato and having a good laugh at my expense. The consequences of failure were obvious. All the cats and the warriors had given me a meaningful look. It had been the kind of look that told you that the cats in particular doubted that unlike them, I dared to die for the sake of this planet. Had they lived here long enough, then they'd have had the same doubts as I did about whether it was worth all the bother the aliens were going to. A villainous crew from another universe was about to knock down some impossible door and rush through. It was ridiculous, because all that would be confronting them was me. If it hadn't been for Jenny and her family and a ghost-liberated Nell drinking wine in her cottage, I'd have found it impossible to motivate myself in that direction, while my feet were urging me contrariwise. Typical of my luck and the cat's general dismissive demeanor, there was still no sign of him. I was thinking about the warrior cookeries on the way over and how handy it would be to have one in my hand. Any monster with something that passed for a brain would want to take a long step back if they saw one of those swinging at them. I really could have done with something like that. Downscaled to my grip size naturally. I was running and falling halfway toward the farmhouse when one magically appeared, stuck in the ground just ahead of me on my right. Sadly not downsized. What the hell am I supposed to do with this? I had hoped they'd give me a weapon I could use to swing around my head a few times before sticking it in the odd alien. The purpose and functionality of the blade were no-brainers even for me, and I had no doubt how good it would be. However, it took a fair bit of rocking back and forwards before I could even lift it. It was a heavy blade with the kind of heft only an 8-foot warrior might regard as practical, and one I could barely drag along the floor. But at least it was giving me ballast against the crazy turbulence knocking me all over the place. I stood there in the middle of the farmyard, bullied by some unholy tempest, and yet I could somehow still smell the chamomile fragrance among the staggering multisensory input. Other than Jenny and a few others, I hated the universe with a vengeance, and most everyone living in it, this one and any other one bastard enough to be watching and laughing at me. A mighty shove in the back would have been helpful right then. But I didn't know who was supposed to be starting this fight. And at that moment, I was so full of hate and loathing that I decided it might as well be me. Anyone or thing daft enough to want to hurt Jenny and make another mess of my garden should consider itself in serious trouble. I felt quite angry for the second time in a few days. It was pretty new for me, and was at last an appropriate response after 2 decades of watching life from the sidelines. I'd silently watched my parents die of appalling diseases, and hadn't even allowed myself to grieve or cry. I'd even allowed that silent lack of expression to point me toward a lovely Parker Knoll, some tablets, and a once lovely woodland. Exactly that. A once lovely woodland, because some bloody aliens decided they wanted to picnic on the locals, and bugger up my self-pitying plans while they were about it. That unexpected emotionality aside, the lack of any other thing happening in terms of an invasion still demanded my engagement with destiny. So I engaged stupid mode properly and began walking toward the house no more than 50-odd yards away, in what I regarded as a relentless zombie pace, half dragging, half carrying the blade. Incidentally, to add a cold sheer layer to the nausea, the house had now started shimmering. Such a horrid manifestation could only be natural in the unnatural. The corners and edges that are usually defined by shades of light and dark were replaced by sharp electric coloration just like neon, and the ozone electric taste was now back in my mouth. The house looked like someone had placed tracing paper over it and drawn the outline with mobile fluorescent inks. The shimmering seemed most substantial at the point of the front door. Why not have an entry into another universe there? I suppose it did make practical sense. The door was being withdrawn into the house from all directions, like the sucking maw of some toothless monster. The situation was outlandish, beyond any human experience as I watched the boundaries of 2 separate universes brought into contact in a hideous conflict. So this is what a proper incursion from another place looked like, upfront and personal? And it seemed to be drawing ours into theirs in the fabrication of the funnel that Arthur had mentioned. It looked like a pressure differential was pushing, or was it pulling our universe into theirs? When these 2 massively powerful entities came into contact, individual weaknesses and strengths struggled against each other with great violence. Crazy static filled the air, and heaven only knew what exotic particles were being formed, being hurled about and destroyed in the process. All other color absented itself, other than the occasional sudden burst of the coarse vulgarity of the electric dark blue over the house and the familiar wild purple sky. Was it only happening here? On the periphery of my glazed vision here on this physical plane, I began to see forms coalescing into vague shapes around me, some barely humanoid and yet familiar. These weren't the warriors for whom I was hoping. Not only were universal boundaries being frayed, but those between us and what might pass for heaven. The dim shadows and forms of persons and creatures that had long passed on from the farm's history seemed to gather in a whimpering crowd behind me. Doubts of my courage and the daftest thoughts passed through my struggling conscious mind. Maybe both heaven and hell were a geographical attachment to the same place? For mere seconds I sensed the confusion of humans and animals brought back unexpectedly into a challenging objective reality. However, their confusion didn't last long because they melted away as if they were scared by what they saw. There was no profit here for cowardly ghosts, and I only hoped there might be one for a cowardly human. I'd swiftly lost interest in ghosts and long-gone lunches of Christmases past, when a thick strand of lightning flashed onto the center of the inverting door. It left an electric aura that stunned me back a pace, then it was deflected onto the upper right window before bouncing back and striking me full square in the chest, knocking me back, and I fell to my knees stunned by an intense and startling agony that I couldn't breathe and I felt I was suffering a heart attack. I could honestly have happily passed out there and then. Bloody hell. Barely anything significant had happened and I was already on the way out, probably making a fool of myself at the same time. But agony is agony, and it was time to consider my own needs. So I brought my left hand up to scratch an itch above my left eye and nearly poked it out with the giant kukri. Nothing had changed. I was still suffering an extended heart attack that would probably accompany me to a non-existent purgatory, except I was somehow able to weave the kukri like an extension to my hand and wrist. Must be a magical blade, I thought. And the distraction of that surprise drew me away from a pain that I realized I was overindulging. This distracted thought process gave me temporary refuge and helped me to regain control of my bludgeoned breathing. I counted slowly and agonizingly up to 10, and while the situation didn't seem to improve, I could at least console myself that it wasn't getting any worse. But that didn't make the pain tolerable as I slumped head down on my hands and knees, one hand to my chest and staring at a large pebble pushed loose on the farmyard floor by my blade. I was in great agony and distraction as I placed the blade flat on the floor and stared through a cold silvery haze, fascinated by the oval stone I picked up and held up in my hand. I wondered from which beach it had come from. But equally, someone could have picked it up from a fast-running stream or river. I let go of the pebble, placed my hand on the blade handle again and wrapped my fingers around the hilt. I wondered if I could find the strength to push up to my feet. The very least I reckoned I should do in the face of whatever was coming through was to smack the first one a futile blow and call it a few names. What I stuck the blade into depended on what it was. If it looked too ridiculous to be considered human, it would soon leaking some vital juices. These were plans being designed from a position of agony and ignorance right then, without even having seen the enemy. If I was going down, I was determined to do so from an upright position. If only I could get back up there. I pushed myself up using the blade and rested a moment, stooped and shaking enough to want to lose consciousness. I was barely able to see any damn thing. Then, for lack of anything better to do, I launched myself at the house and the void that was developing noisily, as if one piece of exotic matter was trying to kiss the other rudely. The coarse wind continued to pound me like a feeble tree being rocked wildly. It sounded like a steam locomotive was entering my head through one ear, going around a bit and then coming out the opposite side. That really put my tinnitus in perspective. I was moving in a tangible jelliform space and felt like I'd be lifted off my feet at any moment. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, another hefty bolt of electrostatic energy smacked me in my chest. Bastard, I thought. It nearly knocked me back down to my knees once again. All my chest muscles contracted painfully, and I knew that if I fell down this time, then I really wouldn't be getting back up. If I impressed and intimidated the alien monsters with my pain management, then they might all decide to turn and run. It was all I had left. And I wondered how the proper plan was going from our team's perspective. From mine, it could have been going a lot better. Death and oblivion were only subtly different shades of the same black, and both were within easy reach if I only applied myself a bit. I declined the invitation of two conflicting universes to collapse again, and chose to employ my new stagger to propel me forward. This pain was far worse than I'd endured when that bastard strode through me. The bloody cheek of it. By the time I was on the inwardly collapsing door, I was nearly on my knees again and only stayed upright by leaning on the kukri. All coherent thinking was left in a bundle of confusion a dozen excruciating steps back. The entire yard, including the fluctuating farmhouse, the destroyed sheds and me, all of us seemed to be revolving in a maelstrom. Everything was bathed in a familiar sickening orange ozone glow. We were definitely in our own space and time. In a nowhere between two impossible places. I chose to vomit quickly. Better out than in, I suppose. I didn't think I'd have to make an apology to anyone, because corpses never get a chance to apologize. I stared through failing eyes, and my mind kept trying again and again to reboot itself, but would only focus on the smell of electricity burning what little hair I had on my head right then. The house's shape kept faltering and becoming tenuous and intent on splitting apart, and anything else stupid enough to be about couldn't have been faring much better than I was. I could only imagine the same must be happening all around me. My eyesight was fading to tunnel vision, and mainly focused downwards. If I looked directly at the nauseating blue and orange of the front door, then I began to retch and convulse immediately. All this was happening to the sound of tiles and stones crashing off buildings behind me. My breathing was rapid and strained. Sensibly, all logic abandoned me to experience rather than observe. All I could think was, this just cannot be bloody normal. It was insane that the cats and warriors could even have begun to think they could depend on me. Of all people. How the hell was I supposed to stem this ridiculous flow of bloody ridiculous aliens? What the hell sort of plan was this? Maybe irony was in play. I was supposed to be the surprise preemptive counterattack, and no one was more surprised than me. There comes a time when you discover the strength invested in your constitution. And that's during a crisis. On the whole, my constitution was holding up well, thank you very much, and an angry conscious effort held my knees in place, denying strong gravity's downward pull. They'd told me that the outcome depended on alleged Satan's arrogance and narcissism, and his belief that we could do nothing with Shadow injured. Shadow and Arthur were convinced that alleged Satan would demand to be the leader. He would be desperate to be the first to steal the glory of the attack on the latest picnic planet. After all, no one ever remembers who was second. So his conceit and vanity had to be his downfall. I only hoped they weren't kidding themselves on that front. Because it had sounded a tenuous plan at best. And I'd had it confirmed that the need for kudos and brown-nosing operated across all sentient species everywhere. They reckoned that he had already been in trouble with his bosses even before Shadow blew up the temporary bubble off the railway line. And he would have been desperate to make amends. Even the evilest entity had to make sure their accounts were balanced. Depravity and profligacy were frowned upon, unless they could turn a decent profit. Whatever their currency. Therefore, he needed a big show. And that meant undermining Shadow, who I now knew absolutely was a significant general in someone's army. It was alleged Satan's only way back. But all the while, I couldn't help thinking that my taking on the enemy solo wasn't exactly an impressive display of defensive or aggressive power. It surely played into his hands. Still, I had my FBK, my effing big knife in my left hand, and it felt glued there. It also had one beneficial use as a prop to stop me from falling over. I felt myself beginning to rot away, being dismantled component by component, and the particles that held thought together were becoming disassociated. There was no longer any conscious intent underpinning anything I was doing, only a ridiculous, relentless, and stupid perseverance. My knees shook uncontrollably. Being close to the appalling physics of an opening breach, I could feel the heat becoming more intense. Skin that was not rotting felt as if it would burn off any second. Yet, being human, and therefore sublimely stupid, I would not, and could not stop. If this was a moment of glory, then it was all rather messy. Yet I hoped that someone was witnessing my endeavors and appreciating my suffering. Why are we humans so bloody desperate for medals and acknowledgement for the most minor of acts? I needed to lean against something quickly, but there was nothing solid anywhere. Everything hard and physical was dissolving and swirling back into the opening vortex. At least the breach didn't seem to be growing much bigger than the size of the door. My restrictive tunnel vision saw the ground beneath my feet begin to dissolve. Not only was the world in trouble, but so was I. And any genes with unrealized dreams of longevity were screaming at me to run. Run? I could barely breathe, let alone run. I guessed that my genes would have to make their own way out via post-facto forensic test tube, because I was never going anywhere again. I leaned my right hand forward to touch nothing. The nothing I touched was smooth and silky in the same way that jelly is when applied straight from the fridge, and it was setting quite nicely around my hand. The intrusion was stabilizing and becoming much more solid in jelly terms. Soon enough, the greedy hordes of hell would cascade through, and all I could do was ask them nicely to stay where they were. I couldn't see them agreeing somehow. If alleged Satan was coming through first, then what would be behind him? The hideous soft chicken turkey monsters from hell? It was then I began to wake up. By which I mean, I began to focus objectively once more and felt the rage growing in me. But of course, it couldn't be my doing. I was far too exhausted to have been drawn back to a rational consciousness without Shadow's assistance. The little bastard was in my head again and fiddling about in there. I would sooner have had the little bastard beside me facing this pan-universal bridge that was taking an age to open up. More to the point, I was glad he'd chosen that moment to visit my brain because I forgot about imminent collapse and straightened up. I rediscovered the stalwartness that had guided me through some horrible times in my life. Right. Okay. I metaphorically dusted myself off and tapped the blade casually against my leg. As you do, I suppose. It was a time for dignity in the face of appalling adversity. I might not go down fighting, but I sure as hell was going to go down with all the cool dignity I could muster, no matter what was about to happen. Time for a game face. I had to decide which one first, and resolved to present a confident smiling face with a fair bit of aggressive cockiness thrown in for good measure. I was angry and proud to be at the front of the queue, waiting to thump demonic beings. I was definitely ready. Whatever came through the door first would receive a solid punch in the face at the very least. I only hoped I wasn't alone and part of some great joke on humanity. Shadow wouldn't do that to me. Would he? I was always uncertain about him. Anyway, that would have to be my last moment of philosophical reflection for a while, if not forever. As the door to another universe finally opened up with a luscious pop, and pushed itself a few feet into our world, I gazed in horror and wonder at the length and breadth of the queue of things waiting there looking hungry but patient. They were stretched out before me across the wide and hideous nightmare plane that I already knew. I was definitely going to need a more extensive glossary of good insults before they got me. My view through the breach was limited, as it was little more than the size of the door right then. But it was definitely growing wider. There was an active queue of things slavering their tongues and various other sensory appendages, eager to come through. The horde of monsters stretched back and broadened into the shadows against a hazy blue-purple landscape that I'd already seen, courtesy of Shadow's delirium and alleged Satan's threats. It was like looking through a small gap across one universe into another. It was much too monstrous a concept to really get a handle on. The sky inside this other impossible place churned and tumbled chaotically over itself in a storm of unbelievable violence. There were huge ragged mountains nearly lost in the far, far distance. Between there and me was a churning mass of grotesque and outlandish creatures, standing bent or crawling. Even a mind as eccentric as Wash would have found it distressing. The entire landscape was full of those forms that seemed to move as a disjointed tidal entity. Yet my mind remained clear of distraction. I saw this endless, this massive horde. Yet the scale meant very little to me. I could only focus on what was directly in front of me and think about dealing with that. It was an useful life philosophy that I was learning too late in my life. It was this lack of broad perspective in life that brought me to this very point in spaces and time, and was now impelling me forward. Shadow and Arthur had been correct. And at the very front of the ugly canteen queue was someone who drew my attention immediately, and made my blood boil. So, limited in my options but with my motivation a solid foundation, I gripped the warrior's kukri firmly in my left hand and stepped forward into that fantastic appalling place, pleased that I had a tangible focus for my anger beyond the unimaginable. Alleged Satan was before me once again. He was still wearing his nice suit and cowboy tie. It seemed that he liked the humanoid form, which made me think of a tricky steamboat gambler and con artist. I was pleased about this human form, because I'd seen enough movies to know how to fight humanoids. I didn't check if he was wearing his patent leathers because I was momentarily amused by the fact that he was distracted. He still hadn't seen me, and was busy making some amusing aside over his left shoulder to a dozen massive odious-looking beasts, either insect angular or wearing borrowed fur coats. They all bore the eager face of a politician confronted with the promise of a free £50 a head buffet. Alleged Satan turned around. In the milliseconds before he saw and recognized me, I assessed that confident smug hubris, and knew it was all deception. Everything close behind him suddenly froze, and without a working knowledge of the particular species, I guessed they looked puzzled. I didn't know what he'd been telling them, but I got the impression that none of the various messy angular floppy and furry lifeforms of various sizes and degrees of hunger and horror expected to see anyone here. I held up the kukri as high as I could, confident that whatever lifeforms out there would see it and me and would recognize it and its significance. Those who could see it, stopped discussing whatever menus and hors d'oeuvres were preoccupying them, and stared up blankly at the unexpected kukri, which seemed to pulsate with a magical pale white light. Those close enough to see, stopped where they were, and simply stared. The alleged Satan hadn't quite completed his new thought yet or the possible implications of my presence. Everything was happening in the time it took one synapse to gather its neurochemicals before flashing a message of concern. The reluctantly orderly queue of the blessed and most prominent at the front lost coherency further back, and I suspected I could see the odd fight breaking out among the orderly impatient and the usual infuriating queue jumpers. There were thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them. I knew there had to be millions as the massive landscape heaved with so many. So many things that only a daft mother could love. The milling crowd within sight or earshot gradually stopped their excitable chatter in a wave moving back at the sight of the blade. As for me, now I was in their space I was temporarily distracted by what I could see behind and through the mad frenzy of inhumanity. The sky behind them was the same sickly colors, and the giant planet in the sky was a Jupiter on a tilt, a cousin maybe. Who said rules had to remain constant from one universe to the next? Finally, alleged Satan's attention brought his eyes to focus on me and mine, with a realization developing in a disturbed slow motion. I smiled madly at him and stared at his left ear in insane focus. He started in shock at this unexpected event, and I suspected I saw panic grow there, even in those black eyes. One of the giant savage furballs behind him reached a hand over his hero toward me. I slapped it back with a deft single-handed swing of the blade. I brought it down with the pointy end poked toward his face. Now, you just wait there, fat boy. I'll get to you in a moment. This dark massive hairy beast just wouldn't be told, and lunged at me with a gigantic clawed paw, which I took off at what I guessed must have been one of its elbows. I carried the swing to its extremity and then brought it back. The blade sliced easily between his massive head and torso, separating the one from the other. The grimacing head bounced into the air, and I reversed my swing again and smacked it with the flat of the blade as it came down, casting it high in a trajectory back toward the lesser-ranked monsters far behind. I was pleased to see it cause a bit of unanticipated comment and panic. The headless body tumbled backwards, its arms waving wildly, and it released a geyser of dark alien blood from the bare neck, and showered everyone not quick enough to move out of the way. I guessed I'd done something good and that the decapitated monster was higher up the food chain than the remainder, hence its position at the front of the queue for lunch. It wasn't something those behind were expecting to see on their day out. Send the bully boy predators in first to sort out any immediate trouble. Then the remainder would rush through to graze on what was left. As a sidebar, I refer you to a piece of research I read many years ago. The word morphism was in there somewhere, as well as labeling and self-labeling in early 20th century gangsterism, Chicago bootlegger-style gangsterism. Hoodlum henchmen rarely turned out to be good-looking. A hypothesis held out that they had ventured into the violent lifestyle because of their threatening looks, protruding Neanderthal foreheads and long faces with square jaws. They were asymmetrical with decent society and symmetrical with resentment and violence. In truth, they were plain ugly, and if you cannot get someone to love you, I think the philosophy goes, then scare, intimidate and kill them. This hypothesis was holding up across universes, it seemed. Most of the creatures were humanoid, or vaguely so if they kept to the shadows. Somehow emboldened and up for it, I shouted at alleged Satan, who stood open-mouthed and shocked. "Well, fancy meeting you here." Another tree trunk arm reached for me. I slapped it back as I had its colleagues. But this one was smarter and immediately pulled his arm and head back. "Just you wait there, you ugly bastard." It must have been Shadow's doing because my voice seemed to reverberate, echoing into the distance and creating a stillness moving back through the horde. Golden flashes of lightning striking made all movement disjointed across the landscape. My spare hand shot out and grabbed alleged Satan by the throat, my hand grip pinching firmly into his windpipe. "Hello, handsome. There's someone who wants a word with you." I was carried forward by a tsunami of a lifetime's anger and frustration. I pushed the bastard back among his colleagues, and it must have made them very uncertain because this isn't what they'd been briefed about. To reinforce their uncertainty further, I raised the blade higher and gave those closest a look that made them take a step back, as far as the masses behind allowed. I swung the blade around in a wide arc to give myself space to work in. For maybe just once in your life, you have absolute power over a situation. These moments are rare and always fleeting, however, you lose nothing by playing it up. I felt emboldened by the uncertainty and growing panic I saw in the eyes of alleged Satan, or whatever he said he was today. I let go of his throat and dragged him into a one-armed embrace, smell or not. He struggled to push me away and was doing his best to transform. And the quick smack of a violent headbutt in the face soon put an end to that. I couldn't give a damn. To his discredit as a bullshit leader, he staggered back another step. About the only thing in their swirling world that wasn't puzzled was Jupiter's lopsided cousin. Monsters, mostly disgustingly misshapen or disjointed and covered in hair, fur or slime, stared at each other in disbelief at my presence. Their enthusiasm for the anticipated Saturnalia was temporarily placed to one side as they tried to work out what was going on. Who is this bloke? And why's the alleged Satan stopped? Or, more pointedly, someone get a bloody move on. Heads and other bits turned to respond to mumbled complaining queries from frightening creatures behind frightening entities. There was bewilderment and uncertainty among many who wished to know why the party was not beginning as promised. Nevertheless, the momentum behind him negated alleged Satan's startled backward step. So I guessed right, did I? I presented my best mate's sardonic welcoming smile and swung the kukri above my head. There was a gasp from the other side of wherever, which in most languages could only be, bollocks. He stood in front of me, nose bleeding and mouth open. His glances over his shoulder suggested that he knew there were tremendous implications to my presence than the hungry horde realized. I kept my grip firm but was losing interest in him as I looked over his shoulder at the crowd. Living a life of quiet isolation, I avoided crowds because of my shyness. But this was no time for shyness and inspecting the broader view. The number of creatures stretching across the appalling plain turned my stomach. And then, a sudden voice in my head shouted, "Look down." I did as my mind instructed, as did alleged Satan. Shadow leapt up and stood sturdily balanced on my right shoulder. Of us all, alleged Satan monsters and me, I was definitely the only one who looked relieved. The monsters immediately behind him had just seen Shadow. Notwithstanding his size, it was pretty clear that the cat had a bit of a scary reputation among them all, and that alleged Satan had lied. Most dogs back off from cats. The beasts attempted to do the same, but it was futile with the nauseating hundreds of thousands pushing them forward. It was obvious from their reaction that alleged Satan must have been telling them that Shadow was finished, and that they probably only had a few warriors with whom to contend. A clamor began behind them that grew louder. I got the impression that those at the back were starting to suspect those ahead were purposefully delaying them, denying them access to the easy spoils. They'd be the ones sucking up algae. It was clear that the news about Shadow hadn't reached them yet. It soon would. I lowered my arms and turned to Shadow balanced on my shoulder. In my head, murmurings suggested that a conversation was going on between Cat and alleged Satan. "Bugger this," I shouted. And leaned eagerly into the fucked up physics between two universes, and wrenched the bastard forward. Someone should have told him that one day, he'd be the one needing a long spoon. Well, today was that day. And the bastard smelled as ugly as his fear. In my struggle not to scream like the alleged Satan, I forgot about the cat because the freezing coursed through me again. I think that either I was shouting or there was a voice like mine screaming inanely in a nearby echo chamber. The chamber was sliced through by seething freezing blades he sought to direct inwards to cripple and kill. A bouncing voice echoed in an abyss, "No weakness. Never mind the pain." At least it wasn't patronizing and telling me to breathe. This was no time for wibbly-wobbly shit. It was a time to shout at the devil, scream in the bastard's ear and use his terror to destroy his army. I was blinded by pain. Every few seconds it coursed and swiveled throughout my entire being, physical and mental. It would swell to the verge of collapse and roughly pull back into me like a serrated knife cutting through my insides. What I was doing would have traumatized any dedicated devil worshipper, and compared to what I suspected the now disappeared shadow was doing, it was nothing. From the fierceness of the diabolical entity struggling in my embrace, I suspected Shadow had switched everything up to 13 and was probably doing his best to protect me simultaneously. I felt terrible. If this were protection, I couldn't imagine how bad it might be without him. Despite this teamwork of human and cat, I sensed more than saw that the funnel was growing wider. Any moment now the terrifying monsters behind would be forced to spill through against their now terrified will. At which point Jenny and unworthy humanity would be in trouble, and our little tussle here would be for naught. I screamed madly at alleged Satan and swung the blade about me to keep others at bay, and felt myself becoming increasingly more redundant because the agony was now damaging. Those black eyes though, although I couldn't be sure, they seemed to be rolling up into oblivion. There was nothing else I could do about him, and I made a conscious choice to push through the pain and focus all my thoughts on Jenny and Nell instead, and I carried on killing and maiming as well as I could under the circumstances. All the while, I felt my feet being pushed back away from the shimmering house as the vaguely rectangular funnel began its multi-dimensional extension into our world. A million lifeforms pushed at us both. I sensed more than I knew that alleged Satan was now the least of our problems. I don't think that it's the motto of any elite cadre of warriors anywhere, but if you're in trouble, then I consider that any shouted bollocks would do. With that in mind, I threw alleged Satan down to one side and reached behind him for the medium-sized pale-furred Sasquatch with black dandruff. In its terror, it dropped its weapon, which appeared to be the correct use for a banjo if you attached blood-soaked spikes to it. I raised the kukri above its head. Not much use for that one, I nodded at the less than gleeful monster with terrified eyes. If I could do that to his hero, then what could I do to a simple grunt with blue snot coming out of orifices on both sallow and sunken cheeks? I wondered briefly what this Sasquatch could have done with its life if it had had a decent upbringing. I reached and grabbed it around the throat and was surprised when it screamed in an unexpected mezzo-soprano voice and cringed backwards. I wondered what it was seeing in my eyes that was not of my conscious manufacture. The beast whinnied in horror, spraying my face with its spittle. I continued to wave the blade belligerently above my head and slashed at those behind my new friend. I occasionally felt it cut through flesh. Maybe if I couldn't see I was doing, I wouldn't be traumatized later. I hoped that logic would hold if I ever made it out of there. I was also hoping that no one in and beyond the funnel could see the frightening absence of support behind me. I screamed again, my voice carrying out into the distance, and I could hear it come back at me. In the distance above the horde, I could see that the demonic chickens and a few gigantic angular dragons had taken to the air and were flying away counter to some bullshit they'd been spouting pre this faltering attack. I, the soft, kind, gentle, unassuming human, was scaring the bejazzis out of an invading army of millions, those who could see me anyway. I released the terrified Sasquatch and began waving gleefully over the crowd. I screamed madly as the lightning flashed off the bloodied blade and counterpointed my cries appropriately. For now at least, all the ducks were still in a reasonably tidy row. But for how long? I held the blade in both hands and started hacking at whatever was closest as I moved forward, clearing a path ahead of me. I don't for a second think that any of the madness they must have seen in my face and eyes was false. Hey, if we could all do this kind of thing and curse and slash at our monsters before dying, how many of us would do it? But I knew it wouldn't be long before some smart aleck monster reached around the rest and twatted me good and proper. That would be the end of me. And any hope of keeping Jenny safe. I had no fear of oblivion, certain that once appropriately fatally twatted, there would be no consciousness to reflect on the emptiness. In the meantime, however, I still felt like I was being turned inside out around my belly button. I kept hacking away and shouting, "Come on." Fluctuations in the pressure generated by the developing breach were beginning to constrain what I could do. Like in fundamental physics, waves do not move, but the energy passes from one particle to the next, giving semblance of movement. Of course, one thing that probably moves faster than any physics is diarrhea. Fear is an energy, and for now at least it was still traveling backwards at a fair pace among the enemy. Yet I knew there were far too many of them throwing energy forward to ever have any hope of stopping them all. I was now desperate for assistance. Anytime you feel like joining in, lads and lasses. It can't all come down to me, surely? My field of vision was diminishing again, coming in from the sides. An essential part of my brain was doing its best to make a sensible decision. A part of me wanted to shut down, but somehow I kept going. I had my own monsters to destroy and friends to protect. The next alien in my embrace peed himself and fainted, which I felt was good and quite powerful. There was a fair bit of howling and, inappropriate for evil aliens, a fair bit of screaming. I guess that observations were hurled about like humans were supposed to be bloody easy. Stuff like that must have been in the ascendancy. I kept striking at anything I could reach and thrusting forward dramatically as distortions of humanity and human imagination struggled to get out of the way of my terrifying blade. I hacked and thrust my way forward. I climbed over the surprised dead, 1 foot at a time, glad they were all becoming too congested to employ weapons against me. All of a sudden, I realized that I wasn't sure whether it was the doorframe moving past me or the other way around. Whichever it was, it just had to be a countdown to my demise and to everyone else's. So I reached to my right, catching alleged Satan by the scruff of the neck as he tried to crawl out of the way. I lifted the bastard upright and dragged us both up on top of a pile of blue-furred dead bodies I'd somehow dispatched. I wanted the scary as shit monsters to see their mighty leader defeated, and with my hand at his throat. Coming through, I screamed in the alleged Satan's ear, although he seemed to be past caring. I felt Shadow's touch had destroyed him and his fragile expectations for the day. That was an aside because by then I'd convinced myself that I could really eat these bastard souls. The many I could see recoiling in fear probably felt the same. I remember thinking, I must have put on the right underpants. I could do no more, and was on my way backwards and downward, still holding up alleged Satan in a death grip for those who could see and share the latest good news with those behind them. Then, a familiar massive 3-fingered hand with its opposable thumb wrapped itself around my chest. In my head, I heard a loud shout delivered in a package posted to the wrong address last week. I sensed the import though. Let him go. So I let alleged Satan fall to the ground and was pulled back as a torrent that couldn't be stopped fell through. Hundreds and hundreds of the bastards, one on top of the other, rapidly filled the space between all the farmyard buildings I was now back among once again. Momentarily, they all seemed confused and sought information and guidance from each other's eyes. A soft chicken monster swept down on me. It, at least, was determined to eat. Take him, shouted the possessor of the hand. It had to be Art or I was in the most significant event on our side of the Big Bang, fading in and out when a soft chicken monster landed in front of me in 2 vertical halves. I looked up as my vision narrowed to a slit and saw the depleted horde cascade and tumble out of the breach toward me. The ground shook thunderously beneath me. The house seemed to be reaching a point of maximum flaring of the funnel, like a school kid trying to pee as high as he could to impress his mates. Through they came, waving arms and armaments of every shape and size that an evil mind could fashion. Surely those who came through couldn't be the best-looking examples of what was out there in any universe. Having been rescued just a moment earlier, I was pushed forward by the same hand and stood facing all the enemies who could see me from the other place. I thrust up my blade and roared at them. Then there was that loud pop. And then the universal funnel suddenly expanded to the full width of the farmhouse, and struggled to expand its stretch even beyond that. It jutted for a few seconds before being sucked back in on itself, leaving the Diners Club from outer space stunned and very much alone. The door back to their particular chez nous had suddenly snapped shut, and in those last few moments, hundreds and hundreds of those bastard things had come tumbling through into the abandoned farmyard, which wasn't exactly how they'd been briefed it would happen. The breach had snapped closed, and everything else was silent. The wind that had accompanied the breach fell away to a vague passing whisper and the sky began to clear to a dusty blue. How the hell that happened I don't know. The last time this had occurred around my humble little cottage, it had needed cats and unimaginable energies that I'm ashamed to say I'd missed in my drunkenness. Maybe the closure had been accomplished by the evil twin engineers in the liminal space in between everything. Of course it had. It was the only explanation. Hell. Shadow really was a tricky and callous little bastard. But now everything that fell through had to die. We couldn't leave them alive, or they'd probably start breeding. Dear Lord, think about the children. Silence held for the briefest moment as most of the aliens struggled up onto their feet with too many curious appendages to count. I was busy experiencing a dizzying assisted transit backward, being thrust from one warrior to the next until my journey stopped for a few seconds, and I stared into the face of the first sarcastic bacon wrangler. Not bad, he shouted in my face. Not bad at all. Now get out of the bloody way, and leave the rest to us. And I was swiftly passed on again. Casting a glance backward as I went, I could see all manner of hideous creatures engage in a bit of appropriate introspection and looking at each other in the hope of leadership. Or at the very least, a bus out of there. All of us could see their leader in his nice shoes trying to sneak away. But like every narcissist I'd ever encountered, there was an amusing flaw in his makeup, namely holes in his immaculate shoes. What else would you expect of a diabolical representation, other than a hole in his soul? It was clear that no one among the motley monstrosities seemed inclined to offer any leadership to their colleagues. Their preparation for the day's events had been one of anticipated indulgent hedonism. Engaging in any life and death team play had not been on their immediate agenda. Alleged Satan had promised them so much, and yet they ended up as nothing more than cannon fodder for a despicable plan devised by Shadow. They kept looking at each other confused and lost for any alternate purpose. When they stopped staring, they began to take in their surroundings and stiffened in a new realization of their predicament. Credit to them, they quickly resorted to default settings. They started roaring and screeching and waving weaponry at their despised warrior enemy who now lay before them around the lower periphery of the yard. There were a few dozen chicken monsters in the air and what could be mistaken for squat feral sheep in dirty dungarees bearing the wrong teeth for polite society. I continued to be passed casually and roughly from one three-fingered hand to the next, and then left leaning against an outhouse at the bottom of the farmyard. Whatever my role had been, it was over. The breach had been closed. Alleged Satan humiliated in front of millions of followers. His match-of-the-day appearance and overambition had ended in failure. Terrible roars of challenge bellowed and echoed off the outbuildings. It was going to be a more serious battle than I imagined. No one was going to step down or step back here. The die had been cast. One side would prevail, and the other die. For my part, I was utterly exhausted and unable and unwilling to move. My back was uncomfortable against the hard concrete rendering of the shed I was leaning against in exhaustion. I couldn't care less. I set the blade against the wall and could do no more than acknowledge my tinnitus and stare up at the sky. The insane boiling purple that had corrupted the sky was no more than a faint hue as particle physics struggled to regain its equilibrium. Then finally, the engineers had closed the breach, and it began to rain heavily. It cascaded down from a clear sky, washing away the wild forces of a moment earlier as the universe cleaned away any contamination. I felt numb all over, especially between the ears. My mind was empty. I guessed Shadow had put down the remote control. After all, he was rather busy doing other stuff. And all the time the ferocious bellowing of a challenge was coming from the direction of the unwashed of another universe. A violent and hungry mass milled in front of the house, filling the yard. Their cries were answered by a frightening silence from the 30-odd warriors who stood silent in a curved line looking up the yard, black-eyed and staring at their enemies. I hoped more warriors were on their way because we looked a bit thin on the ground right then. I was wrong. There should have been a few more hundred of the enemy to make the fight a bit more even. These were giants. In silence the warriors were ready for battle. Their eyes black and hungry for glory. Then in a disciplined sequence, they each reached their fighting hands back and pulled out their long blades. There would be no guns or killer zap rays in their hands. This was going to be a lesson taught. In contrast, their enemy was armed to the teeth with all manner of weaponry, including those strange spiked banjos that made sense. Nevertheless, warriors stood still, poised, their hind legs bent, ready to launch themselves forward. While the residents of Llangwythlog were still struggling in the crowded aisles of Asda Little Iceland Home Bargains and Aldi, the second half of a ferocious battle for planet Earth was imminent. At a glance, the warriors were outnumbered many to one, yet they appeared indifferent to that fact. It was go big or go home time for all those gathered in that unlikely farmyard in a lonely hollow in the middle of a quiet island. The feral sheep broke first, and raged forward across the dozen yards that separated both sides. Within seconds they were met by the surprisingly agile giant warriors who ran forward and fell on them, blades slashing. It was a sickening sight of slaughter. Vital fluids of many hues stained the ground and splashed through the air. It was going to be one hell of a mess for someone to clear up. In little time, the warriors trampled over the dead bodies and bellowed as they charged the remaining hundreds of the enemy who surged forward simultaneously. In some cases, so strange were their fighters that it was difficult to know where one started and the other three finished. Again, evolution revealed its complexity in spades. No matter how awful or appalling their plan, all those gathered were warriors who lived to kill, and probably hoped to die in battle. And die in battle they did. In their hundreds. The frenzy of the fight was appalling and pitiless. Before the enemy could bring their weapons to bear, the warriors were on them, crushing them back against the re-established solidity of the outhouses and old farmhouse, which quaked and tumbled under the assault. The clinical nature of the warriors' action on the enemy brought the battle to a quicker resolution than I'd expected. But what did I know of proper battles? While the warriors might have been cruel in battle, they decently dispatched all the enemy, did not play with them, and only killed them before or after they had fallen. Each enemy soldier died a respectful death by the edge or point of the massive knives borne by each warrior. At the head, and cutting his way through the enemy, weapon economical in its implementation and brutality, had been Artor. He hacked through all who stood before him, rearing and bringing his hooves down on top of the fallen. Then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. There were no groans from the fallen because none were left alive. There was only the ringing in the ears of the absence of the cries and screams of battle. I was surprised by what happened next. Each of the warriors, a few bearing severe injuries and struggling, drew back to the edge of the farmyard and was silent. At a harsh call from their leader, all raised their bloodied blades, bent a knee, and lowered their heads. The feral sheep and sundry villains, too many unidentifiable to me, might have been evil, but they hadn't stepped back from battle. Warriors saluted the fallen. It was a brief statement and a moment that passed quickly. Another bellow brought all to attention. Arthur stepped forward and bowed his head in salute to his warriors, and they responded with the same gesture. Next, they all plunged their blades into the ground to clean them. Only then did they focus on tending their wounds or those of colleagues. Finally, half a dozen giants were relieved to collapse to the ground to be tended to swiftly by their colleagues. Chapter 22. Revealing Shadow's dirty trick. The heavy rain had abated somewhat, but it still fell with the comparatively careless abandon of someone eager to clean up after unfortunate visitors. It diluted the rivulets of the blood and gore that meandered aimlessly downhill across the broken concrete. The soil here would eventually consume the blood, and there would probably be an eternal and unconscious memorial to what had passed here once. I felt stunned after what I'd just seen, albeit horrible and bloody in all hues. There was a nobility to it all. Yet I felt a sickening shiver as I gazed around the hundreds of broken bodies. Victory is ours, friend. Arthur was beside me with a look of sadness in his eyes. It is always terrible, the darkness after a battle. I looked at the countless dead bodies again. What was muscular in conflict was rendered flaccid and useless in death. There was only dignity for those who survived to be able to walk away. Everything else had to be lies. Violence is never pretty, but warfare is appalling. Not one of the hundreds of alien beasts forced through had survived, not even those in the air. Their bodies were piled high. Despite their fierceness in battle, the monsters had not managed to prevail against a much smaller band of giant warriors. The respectful nods in my direction suggested that while humanity might not have redeemed itself, at least it seemed I had. You'd have thought that I couldn't look at these persons in the same way, knowing they were killers. Yet every society needed its licensed killer. After all, I was one now. Several times over, in fact. I felt fierce pride in my new friends and, strangely, great pity for those not going home tonight. Okay, so they'd come to kill and eat every human or animal currently ambling or crawling across the face of our world. On the other hand, our warriors had been a sharp sword and firm shield for all life on this planet, and no one else on this puny planet would ever know of their courage. What about the remainder that didn't come through, I asked, wiping the rain streaming down my face and wondering how I was managing to stay standing. Then, stunned by exhaustion, I pointed up the yard to the farmhouse's front door and asked him, "What about beyond? There are still millions of them out there." That sad look of reflection, that darkness left his face and broke into a broad smile. I nearly fell forward when he slapped me on my back. But, thankfully, he caught me. It will be long before they even think about gathering and following anyone on such a venture here, or maybe anywhere else again. But they will? Maybe. But not for a very long time. He turned me round to face him and gently placed his two massive hands on my shoulders. The enemy will remember you. And they will remember how you single-handedly killed thousands, destroyed and captured their cowardly leadership, and closed the breach with your own hands. Legend will remember nothing else. Your role today was to stop them in their tracks. The adversary, or alleged Satan as you call him, is now a prime example of hesitancy and fear. He make the remainder question their confidence in leadership and their future. You showed that the inhabitants of this planet were not easy prey like they be told. They may turn on each other in hunger. Also, the engineers are now focus all energy on weak points like here. Hope to close them permanently, or at least make them stronger. I thought back on my fright and exhaustion. I'd been hoping that you might have intervened sooner. I wished to. But the Old One stayed our hand because at that time he saw that even single-handedly you achieved more psychology with your anger and ferocity than we would have with our swords. When you held him aloft by his throat for all to see. He shook his head in wonder. The Old One saw your success in diminishing the alleged Satan before his fighters. Those close were drawing away from you. You were magnificent for a man who wishes no more in his life than to grow a garden and be invisible. You earned the respect of all. Far more than you can imagine. Persons like you are rare, however, in a population of billions there are enough of you to make a difference. He dropped one hand and turned me to look at his warriors, some of whom were taking a moment to reenact their part in the battle and ridicule a few of the others in how they bore their weapons. Others were tending to the badly injured. He pointed to his warriors and then back to me. There is nothing more fearsome to an enemy than a foe who does not care that they be injured or killed. Today they saw this in you. One person, one Earth person alone. I also wager that those on the other side of the breach will describe Earth person as 10-foot monster who killed their leader, drew hundreds through, closed the breach, and killed them all without mercy. The Old One wanted to ensure that only he and you seen, until engineers can close the breach. I didn't do much really, I said. I feel sort of slightly embarrassed I lost my temper the way I did. The warrior dropped his head and snorted. I believe you have never known how great you are, or could be, your entire life. He reflected on this for a moment and said soberly, there again, who can say? Maybe everything you have endured your entire life and those of your sires was intended for this moment alone. Personally, I think you have been angry for a long time. This not healthy. Now it is spent. The sour and coppery smell of battle still hung heavy over the scene. Arthur looked at the house that had rediscovered its painfully slow engagement with entropy. Other than the welts and splashes of blood and gore running down its frontage, it was unchanged. The outhouses were no better. In their high gutters I saw a few heads balanced there, one with a futile wolfish grin gazing hideously down at me. I looked away, having already seen more than my fill. Do not worry, he laughed loudly. You may not need to be this angry again in your lifetime. Beyond the time and space of your universe, the legends about you and Earth people are already growing. Old One's agents will add to them. My eyes were stinging with exhaustion and I shook my head forlornly. And all along, everything I've suffered was all part of that little bastard's plan, wasn't it? He appeared shocked that I referred to his Old One like that. Then he shrugged. You may know him differently from me. However, you fought well and earned our respect. So I allow you your opinion. Talking of your Old One. Where is he? With the leader of the host of evil? The one you call alleged Satan is a broken force because you destroyed his standing. He cannot return. The Old One will empty his mind of vital intelligence. As far as his race is concerned, a mad giant human warrior has eaten him. I managed to laugh at the very thought. Sometime, friend, one need only fight small battles to win wars. And what happens to him? Knowing the Old One, a deal will be put. Either alleged Satan agrees, or he ends up in pieces like these unfortunate fools over there. Somehow inured, I looked again at the travesty that warfare must always leave behind. At least this time there were no innocents involved, save for me. I thought of the utterly harmless people of Flangwithlog, several of whom probably still hoped for a lapdancing club, all in a queue in Aldi, confused as to why they were buying more than they needed or could ever store. I suppose it could be worse, I said. What a stupid thing to say. I was back in normal human mode again, exercising the art of inappropriate responses that humans excel in. So he's gone. Where? The Old One? Above my pay grade, friend. Always big things going on. Big persons who use us but do not understand soldiers always. Big persons. More cats. The great warrior rolled his eyes. Always more cats. As I say, above our pay grade. Easier down here in the mud, I think. More honest. He smiled as he shook his head in mock bewilderment. So what now? The bodies of the fallen will be disposed respectfully. We will open up a place for them and leave indications of their battle here, and of their defeat. The spaces between universes are sadly full of such places. Did you lose anyone today? Today we are lucky. He followed my gaze over the half-dozen or so wounded being tended to by colleagues. Some injured, some seriously. They will survive. Some will not fight again. But they were here and they fought. A world was saved. Today brings great honor to their families. I felt a dark heaviness descend over me and deep-seated exhaustion squeezed every cell in my body. It was that seething chemical tiredness of fatigue in concert with my tinnitus. I knew my brain was signaling for the rest of me to shut down, and it would be foolish to fight it. What do I do now? Arthur stretched and the muscles of this powerful sentient creature danced an equally exhausted fandango from shoulders to neck. He would not rest until all his warriors were okay, and the fallen enemy disposed of respectfully. Now go to your home, tend your plants and celebrate your role in this fine battle today. He again placed 2 hands on my shoulders again and looked deeply into my eyes before speaking. You now live beyond this. You hear? The Old One tells us about you. You live again. You grow many gardens. You rejoice in life after seeing so much death. Give life value as you have today. Not necessary to kill anyone, hopefully. I dropped my chin and shook my head. He placed an arm around my shoulders. You must pay accord to what has happened. No one else but you will ever know. However, someone should know. What about Shadow? I asked. The Shadow. He tasted the words. I like the name. That is a perfect name for someone who connives and fights subtly from the shadows to avoid greater conflict. Who knows what he will do next? He stuck out his hand, 3 large muscular fingers and a massive opposable thumb, and grasped my arm in a Roman martial salute. His gesture was complete and my small hand had to be symbolic. Go home, friend, he said. We will meet again. I am sure of that. We have found a worthy ally here on your planet. And what about you? What will you do after this? He took in a deep breath and pondered my question before answering. Maybe we have time to be with our family. Hopefully. Then next battle. The enemy is always clever, which demand we have always be cleverer. We'll see. Now go home. Rest. You draw attention of universe. Maybe it like you. Maybe it challenge you more. Go home. Epilogue. There. It was all over. The world had been saved. And now, somehow, everything went back to normal. How though? We'd all fought a messy battle, and the forces of good had prevailed. I hoped anyway. Shadow always left me uncertain about his plan for anything he did. For all I knew, this might only have been phase 1. Well, that was again above my pay grade. All I knew was that the boundaries between two universes had been re-established, and a big pile of messed up bodies had been deposited in a dignified manner in the space between spaces. For my part, I'd lost my temper, screamed and upset some confused aliens, and made a mess of quite a few of them. And now I was back to my own normal, and feeling rather embarrassed. I am an idiot after all. Shadow though. I learned that he had taken significant risks on many occasions to be injured repeatedly, to mislead the enemy in their planning. What if he'd been killed? I paused. Where would that have left Jenny, me and all my friends? Dead, I suppose. It was a horrible what if? And I didn't wish to ponder on it any further than that. I certainly didn't feel like a hero as Arthur wanted me to believe. In my world, no one was about to label me as anything other than that strange bloke with the scary black cat. Would I remain that, I wondered? The last time I'd seen Shadow, he'd been terrorizing a terrifying demon. I drove home wanting to lean my head on the steering wheel and trust my blue chariot to destiny. And I really shouldn't have been driving because I wasn't safe. My vision had broadened a bit, but I certainly wasn't keeping to the legal requirements of the highway code. And the road was amusingly busy. The road was busy because Shadow had removed the mental barricade. Of the dozen cars I passed coming into the small village of Bodford, everyone looked whacked and thoroughly shopped out. The piles of toilet paper in the back seats made it feel like it was Brexit all over again. Also, most people looked stunned with that hurting face as they stared out through their rain-swept windscreens. It made me think, and I wondered if the rain was part of the healing of the wounds by the engineers, the smug little bastards they were. When I finally got home and sat down on my end of the sofa, there was nothing left to give. I was too tired to sleep and just sat there with my tinnitus filling my head. And because I was over-adrenalized and knew I needed an anesthetic to carry me over the activation energy and into Betty Bobo's land as soon as possible. The blessing of unconsciousness would hopefully help me escape the many images that were beginning to gather graphically in the corners behind my eyes. With a little energy left, I struggled back to my feet and went to make myself a nice cup of tea. I looked about the place, my eyes stinging. Shadow had planned everything from his home on the sofa. Nobody would ever know that we'd saved the world from here. This invisible little cottage in the middle of nowhere, my homely little cottage, and there was nothing to show that anything extraordinary had ever happened here. Perhaps one day I would reenact the entire battle for the planet for other bemused residents at the home for the perpetually groovy. As I sat there sipping a cup of tea in the perfect zone, I felt loneliness settle over me. I checked Shadow's corner. Now the battle for here was over, would I ever see him again? I must have slept one of those seriously immobile catatonic sleeps. Because when I woke up, I found myself in a darkened room with a roaring fire on the go. I felt something in my left hand, and when I checked I found I was gripping a banana. Don't you bloody dare. I placed the banana on the small table, took a sip of the cold tea, the tea had left the perfect zone ages ago, and turned to my left. There, squeezed in his usual corner was Shadow, a cat who was cat-sized and not the unlikely giant who bestrode universes and destroyed his many enemies. Instead, for all the world to see, he was a simple little cat whose sides moved gently in and out as he slept. Are you going to tell me what happened after I left? I asked. Shadow lifted the paw off his nose, turned to me, and did one of those winking eye things. That was a no. Probably. Okay. I pushed myself up to make supper for us both. I'll get your favorite salmon mousse, if there's any left. The cat just grunted. I suppose I take that as a thank you? I didn't think he even knew those two important words, let alone the concept. So it goes to show something or other, I suppose. I checked the time and saw it was just gone midnight, but I was suddenly hungry for food. A plate of fish fingers with homemade savory potato wedges and a tin of marrowfat peas would do me nicely. As I believe, then so shall it be. Or some bollocks like that. I might even start writing poetry again. I'm sure my unconscious would come up with some really interesting stuff. In the meantime I engaged with my aching body, and groaned as I pushed myself up from the sofa. I turned to Shadow. I might have pulled a muscle, I said. Hardly surprising, is it? At the sink, I stood pondering my recent life and waiting for my cuddle on a plate to develop. I thought about Jenny, and a question rose from the murk. Should I text her and tell her I'd just saved the world that very afternoon? I needed to hear her voice and be harangued by her. But it was late. My attention was drawn to the internal windowsill where I kept the redundant landline and the futile answering machine. The light on answering machine was flashing red. That was strange, because hardly anyone knew my number, apart from an exceptionally bored denizen of the dark web probably. But some person had left me a message. I wondered who and went to have a look. I checked the number and didn't recognize it, so it could well be about my alleged accident again. Anyway, the cooking could manage on its own for a moment. Let's have a look, shall we? I said to Shadow, who appeared interested for once. I listened to the message with an amusement that tumbled away quite quickly into surprise and finally shock. I replaced the phone on its stand and turned to Shadow. It was my bookie, I said. I don't have a bookie, and Shadow knew I didn't have a bookie because I don't gamble. Two things, Shadow. One, they wanted to tell me that they won't be accepting any more bets from me because. I took in a deep breath. I was still pumped up on the day's adrenaline overloads. They won't be accepting any more bets from me because I keep winning. Up until recently, my only vices had been wine and despondency. I'd never been inside a betting shop and didn't even know what they did in there. And second, they've deposited all the winnings into my bank account. For the second time in the last 24 hours, I found myself in deep shock, and all the while the cat looked as if he was smiling at me. Either that or he had wind. Do you know how much you had in there? I had to sit down on the sofa's armrest and wait for my head to clear. This was a day of surprises after all. So why not this? It was a ridiculous amount of money. I mean, a really ridiculous amount for someone in my circumstances. Beating trans-dimensional creatures I could do, but being normal always escaped me. So it was now obvious that whatever I had had in mind for myself would have to be reconsidered. I could even think of expanding my garden up toward the greenhouse, have the car sorted once and for all. Even buy a new sofa, if the cat would allow me to dump his favorite place in this particular dimension. Next year. I thought about Arthur's words about living beyond whatever had just happened. We'll just have to wait and see. Shadow took advantage of the moment and hopped off the sofa and stared at his empty food bowl. The Galactic Warrior had just issued another order, and I hoped he was in the mood for whitefish, because it looked like Arthur had eaten everything else.